Usually when we talk about a financial dispute, there's this underlying assumption of precision, right? You expect it to function a bit like engineering. Or, I don't know, maybe like an X-ray.
Right, yeah, like a diagnostic tool.
Exactly. You look at your bank statement, you see a charge you definitely didn't make. The bank pulls up their data, points to the anomaly and says, there it is, fraud, let's fix it.
Which is how we all want it to work. The assumption is that the system is fundamentally binary. It's either authorized or it's not authorized. And the mechanisms for determining that are supposed to be clean and visible to everyone.
But then you introduce the actual architecture of modern financial technology into the mix. You mix legacy banking bureaucracy, so the old school mainframes and regulations, with these new frictionless buy now, pay later applications. And suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely broken.
Oh, it's shattered. It becomes the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Right. We're looking at a dispute landscape where the banks themselves don't even seem to know how their own plumbing works.
And, the complexity is kind of the point. When you have multiple layers of financial institutions, tech platforms, merchants, all sitting between the consumer and their own money, accountability gets incredibly diffused.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we have a really fascinating, highly complex premise to explore with you. We are going to look at what happens when a relentless, highly educated consumer gets caught right in the crosshairs of identity theft, legacy bank processing, and that whole move fast and break things reality of modern fintech.
Yeah, and our mission today is to answer a very specific high-stakes question based on this massive stack of documents we've been going through. The question is, does Dr. Benjamin James Royer have a substantive and valid claim against the buy now, pay later platform Sezzle, its partner WebBank, and the banking giant Capital One?
And to get to the bottom of this, we are pulling from a remarkably dense paper trail. I mean, we have an official Federal Trade Commission identity theft report. We have internal customer service call transcripts from Capital One. We have this ridiculous 216-page evidence packet that the bank tried to use to just, shut this entire dispute down.
Which we will definitely get into.
Oh, absolutely. We're also parsing through these deep dive forensic legal memorandums authored by Dr. Royer himself, plus systemic consumer finance white papers and active federal court class action filings.
It's honestly rare to see a paper trail mapped out with this level of clinical precision. I mean, he didn't just file a standard customer service complaint. He practically mapped the entire architecture of what he calls dispute suppression in American consumer finance.
Dispute suppression. I love that term. Because imagine you check your own phone right now and see a charge you don't recognize. Think about the steps you take to fight it and the brick walls you inevitably hit. That is what makes this so relevant to you listening. If you have a checking account or if you have ever used an app to split a payment into 4 installments, the systemic loopholes we are about to expose directly affect you.
They absolutely do. It's about the mechanics of how your money is protected, or rather, how it isn't protected at all.
Right. So let's start at the genesis of the fraud to understand the timeline, because the chronological sequence of events becomes absolutely critical when the bank tries to shut the door on his claims later on. So where does the breach actually originate?
So the origin point traces back to a data breach that occurred between January 7th and 8th of 2026.
Okay.
This breach hit a platform called OpenLoop Health, which is the operator for a telehealth merchant known as MEDV.
Okay.
And this is where his personal information was compromised.
Which, unfortunately, is basically just the background radiation of modern life at this point. The data breaches happen constantly. But what does the actual fallout look like in his bank account?
The fallout is severe and it's sustained. Between January 2nd and April 6th, 2026, he was the victim of 105 unauthorized transactions.
Wow. Over 100.
Yeah, we're talking about a slow, methodical drain. These transactions totaled $2,807.59, and they were debited directly from his Capital One checking account via WebBank and Sezzle virtual cards.
Just a constant bleed.
Exactly. And if you look at the wider scope across all of his compromised accounts, the total fraudulent amount was actually $3,720.59.
Okay, so over 100 individual transactions bleeding the account dry over a period of roughly 3 months. But there is a massive complicating factor here regarding his personal life during this exact window, right?
Yes. Right in the middle of this fraud window, on February 3rd, 2026, Dr. Royer suffered a severe cardiac event.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we are not talking about a minor hospital visit here. This was a major medical crisis. And to prove it, he eventually submitted contemporaneous third-party medical documentation, specifically from his cardiologist, proving that this event rendered him entirely unable to perform ordinary daily duties for an extended period.
Right, and I want to pause on why this specific detail, the medical documentation, is so legally vital before we even look at how the banks investigated the fraud. Because if a bank sees that a customer waited 3 months to report over 100 fraudulent charges, their first instinct isn't to look for a hacker. Their first instinct is to look at the calendar.
Right, exactly. And to understand why that is, we really have to look at the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, or the EFTA. This is the federal law established back in 1978 to protect consumers when they transfer funds electronically.
Right.
And under the EFTA, your liability for unauthorized transfers is strictly tied to reporting timelines.
So walk us through those tiers, like how fast do you actually have to report?
It's structured specifically to penalize delay. So, if you report the unauthorized transaction within 2 business days of learning about the loss or theft, your liability is capped at $50.
2 days is practically nothing.
It is very fast. But if you report it after 2 days, but within 60 days of the bank sending the statement showing the unauthorized transfer, your liability jumps to $500.
Okay, and if you wait longer than that, 60 days, it's say because you're recovering from a heart attack.
If you miss that 60-day window, you could literally be on the hook for everything. Just unlimited liability for any transfers made after the 60-day period. And because of this structure, banks utilize these notification timeframes as a highly effective procedural off-ramp.
A procedural off-ramp, I like that.
Yeah, because if they can mathematically prove you reported the fraud late, they don't have to spend a single dime investigating the merits of the hack or the identity theft. They just cite the EFTA timeline, deny the claim, and close the ticket.
Boom. Done. But this is where the strategy in his memorandums becomes so fascinating to me. He completely anticipates this exact procedural maneuver from Capital One. He doesn't just call customer service and say, hey, I was sick, please give me leeway.
Yeah.
He digs directly into the foundational architecture of his banking relationship.
He really does. He goes straight to the source code of the agreement, which is Capital One's own electronic fund transfer disclosure contract. And buried in that fine print, he finds an extenuating circumstances clause.
Wow.
The bank's own contract explicitly lists a quote-unquote hospital stay as an example of a situation that tolls, meaning it legally pauses or extends the notification clock.
It's incredible. I mean, it's like Capital One builds this massive fortress of terms and conditions designed to limit their liability, and he just finds the exact key they left under the mat in their own paperwork.
Precisely. And he provides the signed disability benefit request from his cardiologist, officially proving incapacitation.
So by establishing that timeline and providing that specific third-party proof, he legally told the clock. He completely removed Capital One's easiest excuse to dismiss the case.
Yes. The procedural off-ramp is totally blocked.
Which forces Capital One to do what, exactly?
It forces them to actually do their job. Under the EFTA, once a consumer provides timely notice of an error, the financial institution has a statutory obligation to conduct a reasonable investigation into the merits of the claim. They can't just look at the calendar anymore. They have to look at the data.
Okay, so the bank is forced to investigate. But let's look at the rules of engagement for that investigation, because this brings us to a really common misconception about financial fraud. I think most people assume that if your bank account is drained, the burden is kind of on you to prove that it wasn't you who spent the money. But the law actually says the opposite, doesn't it?
It does, and that is a fundamental misunderstanding that financial institutions often rely on, frankly, to discourage consumers from pushing back. Under the EFTA and its implementing regulation, which is known as Regulation E, the burden of proof rests entirely on the financial institution.
Entirely on the bank.
Entirely. Capital One bears the legal burden of proving that a disputed transaction was authorized by the consumer.
Which means the consumer is not required to prove a negative. Which logically just makes sense. I mean, how do you definitively prove you didn't press a button on a smartphone at 3 in the morning while you were asleep? You literally can't.
Precisely. You can't prove a negative, so the law mandates the bank must prove the positive. They have to prove you did authorize it. But, and this is the big but, introducing a buy now, pay later app like Sezzle into the equation complicates the mechanics of that authorization massively.
Right, because we aren't just swiping a debit card at a grocery store anymore. Dr. Royer maps this out in his legal memos as a 3-legged transaction architecture. And I was trying to visualize this when I read it. Usually a transaction is a two-way street, right? Me and the merchant. But throwing Sezzle in creates a triangle. So how exactly does the legal liability map onto those 3 distinct lines of communication?
Let's break down the mechanics of the three legs, because conflating them is exactly how the banks try to avoid liability here. Leg 1 is the authorization with the end merchant, so in this case, MEDV. This is simply the agreement to buy a specific product or service.
So that's just the cart checkout.
Exactly. Leg 2 is the authorization for Sezzle, which is backed by WebBank, to extend credit to the consumer for that specific purchase. So you are asking a third party for a microloan.
The underwriting phase.
Yes.
Yeah.
And finally, Leg 3. This is the authorization for Sezzle to actually reach into the consumer's primary bank account, Capital One, and pull the money out via an automated clearinghouse, or ACH debit.
So it's 3 distinct steps, requiring 3 distinct forms of consent, governed by completely different agreements. And this is where Capital One makes a fatal error in their investigation, isn't it?
A catastrophic error. On April 30th, 2026, Capital One denied his 5 active Regulation E rebuttals. They sent these denials in this rapid-fire cluster, and their entire legal justification rested on a single template sentence.
Yeah, I have the transcript of that denial right here. It says, quote, "The information provided by the merchant shows you authorized the transaction."
And that is where he catches them, because he accurately argues that Capital One completely conflated the 3 legs of the transaction. Proving leg 1, that Sezzle paid a merchant for a product, does absolutely nothing to prove leg 3, that he legally authorized Capital One to allow Sezzle to pull ACH debits from his checking account.
But let me just play devil's advocate here on behalf of the bank for a second. If Capital One's automated systems see a request coming from a legitimate multi-million-dollar fintech company like Sezzle, a company that processes millions of these transactions a day via secure APIs, isn't it reasonable for the bank to just assume the user authorized it? Doesn't the fact that the digital request successfully crossed the API bridge kind of imply consent?
Well, from a software handshake works, so the system assumes validity, but assuming validity based on system architecture is not the legal standard under federal law.
Right.
The EFTA doesn't care about API handshakes. It cares about actual consumer authority.
Yeah.
The bank is legally required to conduct a reasonable investigation to prove that the human being attached to the account actually authorized the transfer.
So they can't just say, well, the computer said it was okay.
No, they can't. And if we zoom out and connect this to the broader picture of consumer finance, this is a massive systemic issue across the entire banking industry. The sources show that the New York Attorney General is currently suing Citibank over this exact kind of EFTA violation.
Really? Citibank too?
Yeah, the AG is arguing that Citibank fails to protect consumers from unauthorized wire transfers, specifically because they rely on flawed automated assumptions and summarily deny claims without any human investigation.
And there are active class action lawsuits dealing with this specific wording we're talking about too.
Yes. Look at Walton v. Capital One. It is an active class action lawsuit specifically targeting Capital One for summarily denying fraud claims with the exact boilerplate phrase "didn't find an error" without providing any substantive written explanation of the investigation.
Just a rubber stamp.
Exactly. The lawsuit argues that Capital One has deliberately adopted a process that unlawfully reverses the evidentiary burden. It creates a system where the bank always wins because they define the mere existence of the charge as proof of authorization.
Which is wild. Okay, so
Yeah.
Capital One says, the merchant says you did it, case closed. And Dr. Royer says, hold on, under the law, you bear the burden of proof. Show me the evidence you relied on. Because he has a statutory right to demand the bank's homework, essentially.
Absolutely. Under Regulation E, specifically Section 1005.11D1, if a bank determines that no error occurred, they must, upon request, promptly provide the consumer with copies of the documents they relied on to make that determination.
Which sets the stage for one of the most revealing moments in this entire deep dive. Because Capital One actually complies. They send him the evidence package they used to deny his claim. And this brings us to what we can call the 2-minute investigation and the Apple Preview red squares.
Yes. Capital One supplies him with a 216-page evidence package to justify their denial.
216 pages of data. I want to just try and put myself in his shoes for a second. You're recovering from a cardiac event, you've got thousands of dollars stolen, and a massive bank dumps a 216-page PDF on you and basically says, here's our undeniable proof. Most people would look at the sheer weight of that document and just give up. They'd assume the bank did a thorough forensic analysis. But he literally forensically analyzes the bank's forensic analysis. So what exactly does he find in those 216 pages?
He discovers that this massive document, the foundational bedrock of Capital One's denial, wasn't authored by a Capital One fraud investigator at all. By analyzing the metadata and the annotations within the PDF, he reveals it was authored entirely by a Sezzle employee named Lauren Doolittle.
Wait. Capital One's legally mandated reasonable investigation was literally just taking the accused company's internal paperwork, slapping the Capital One logo on it, and presenting it as independent proof.
It is actually worse than that.
How could it be worse?
Because when he looked closely at how this evidence was compiled, he found that the Sezzle employee, Lauren Doolittle, had batch-applied identical red squares and text annotations across the document using a basic, off-the-shelf Mac program called Apple Preview.
You have got to be kidding me. I use Apple Preview to highlight recipes? You're telling me she's using MS Paint-style digital crayons to draw red boxes around data points?
Exactly. The annotations inside these crude red squares read things like, checking account selected by the customer. And Capital One accepted this merchant-provided, manually annotated, unverified PDF as absolute, undeniable proof.
They didn't verify the IP addresses, they didn't cross-reference digital signatures or anything.
They did no independent verification whatsoever. They simply forwarded Sezzle's chargeback rebuttal document and legally classified it as a Capital One investigation.
It's like an automated factory line where someone hit the emergency stop button in the Sezzle building because of a data breach. But Capital One's conveyor belt is in a completely different building, completely hardwired to just keep stamping out collection notices until a human physically cuts the power. How does a massive financial institution operate like this? I mean, how is this legally justifiable as a reasonable investigation?
Well, to understand the mechanics of why this happens, we have to look at the white paper he authored, titled The Architecture of Dispute Suppression. Because he pulls back the curtain using sworn deposition testimony from another case involving a Capital One team leader named Pamela Pesky. And this testimony is incredibly revealing about the physical reality of how banks handle these claims.
What does the deposition actually say?
It reveals that Capital One handlers process up to 4,000 disputes a day.
4,000 a day. That volume is staggering.
And it gets more specific. They operate under a strict quota of 30 disputes per hour.
Okay, wait. 30 disputes an hour. If you do the math on that, that leaves exactly 2 minutes. 2 minutes to evaluate, investigate, and resolve a federal financial fraud claim. You can barely read a multi-threaded email chain in 2 minutes, let alone conduct a forensic financial investigation under the strict mandates of the EFTA.
Which introduces a critical concept, systemic accountability diffusion. Capital One fundamentally doesn't have the time, the budget, or the human manpower to investigate 4,000 claims a day, so they rely entirely on an automated system to query Sezzle. Sezzle, in turn, relies on automated AI chatbots and whatever raw data the end merchant, Emmy Davy, provides. Everyone in this financial ecosystem is just pointing the finger at the next link in the chain. Ultimately, no human being is actually doing the forensic work mandated by federal law, except for the victim.
Right. He is the only one actually looking at the data. So Capital One's entire defense is resting exclusively on Sezzle's evidence, the Apple Preview red squares. Capital One has no independent data, so he realizes, fine, if Sezzle's PDF is your only proof, I'll audit Sezzle's internal data myself. And this is where the entire narrative shifts, leading us to what he calls the evidentiary trilemma.
This is where he sets a brilliant logical trap. He digs past the red squares and looks at the raw data buried inside Sezzle's 216-page chargeback rebuttal package. He's looking specifically at the account profile that Sezzle generated to prove the account indisputably belonged to him, and he finds a mechanical database failure that is absolutely staggering.
Okay, imagine looking at a document a company swears is your personal profile and seeing a contact method you have never used in your life. Tell us about the specific email address you found.
Buried right there in Sezzle's own documentation, it showed that the verified email address on Dr. Royer's Sezzle account was drew.kramer@wisconsin.gov.
A .gov email address on a consumer shopping app. Let's unpack the mechanics of this, because who on earth is Drew Kramer?
Drew Kramer is an official state investigator for the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, the DATCP. Crucially, he is the specific state investigator who was assigned to investigate Sezzle on Dr. Royer's behalf after he filed an official state regulatory complaint regarding this exact fraud.
I have to pause because this is almost too absurd to be real. Sezzle submitted a document to Capital One claiming it was absolute proof of his identity, and the verified email address belonged to the actual state investigator looking into Sezzle for fraud.
Yes.
How does a software system even make a mistake of that magnitude?
It comes down to how customer relationship management, or CRM, databases function. Systems like Zendesk or Salesforce are designed to track interactions. When the state investigator, Drew Kramer, sent an email inquiry to Sezzle regarding the case, he likely included the account number or case number in the subject line. Sezzle's back-end architecture is apparently so poorly siloed that instead of keeping that regulatory inquiry separate, the database's fuzzy matching algorithm simply appended the inbound.gov email address directly into the primary user's permanent profile.
That is insane. It's like a filing cabinet where the folders have no tabs, so the automated clerk just shoves the police report into the suspect's diary and calls it a single document.
Precisely, and this mechanical failure is what gives him the ammunition to completely destroy Capital One's defense. He presents Capital One with a trilemma. Because Sezzle officially submitted this document claiming this .gov email was the verified contact, they have mathematically restricted the universe of reality to exactly 3 mutually exclusive options. No fourth option is logically available.
Okay, let's hear the 3 options.
Proposition 1. Dr. Royer fraudulently used the official government email address of a Wisconsin state investigator to open and operate a Sezzle account to commit retail fraud.
Which is an absurd accusation of identity-related misconduct and a potential felony against a state official. Not going to happen.
Exactly. Proposition 2. The state investigator, Drew Kramer, was the one using the account to buy things on the internet while investigating the case.
Also completely absurd, professionally catastrophic for the investigator, and utterly contradicted by the police reports and FTC filings, which leaves us with the only reality governed by the laws of physics.
Proposition 3. Sezzle's authentication architecture is fundamentally broken. When the state investigator inquired about the account, Sezzle's database erroneously merged the investigator's contact data into the user's permanent profile. And then this is the critical part Sezzle outputted that definitively corrupted data as evidence of identity, and Capital One accepted it without question.
So if option 3 is the only logical reality, then every single piece of evidence Sezzle handed to Capital One is legally contaminated.
It is the kill shot for Capital One's EFTA defense. You cannot legally sustain a burden of proof using definitively corrupted data. If Sezzle's system mechanically cannot tell the difference between the account holder and a government investigator looking into the account, it fundamentally cannot prove who authorized a digital transaction. The foundation of that 216-page packet just evaporates.
Poof. So Capital One's defense collapses because Sezzle's data is corrupt. But that raises a bigger question, I think. If Sezzle's internal data architecture is this chaotic when it comes to simple email addresses, how are they handling the actual complex financial regulations governing these lines? Because Sezzle wasn't backing down quietly, were they? They were aggressively interacting with him while all this was happening. And he wondered the same thing, which led him to audit their compliance with federal lending laws.
Yes. He looked beyond just the unauthorized debits and decided to audit the entire structure of the loans Sezzle claimed he owed. He meticulously analyzed 38 separate truth in lending disclosures, or TILITIs, that were generated by Sezzle and its originating bank partner, WebBank, during these fraudulent transactions.
And for context for you listening, the Truth in Lending Act, or TILA, is designed to ensure consumers know exactly what a loan costs before they agree to it. It mandates clear disclosure of terms like the annual percentage rate, finance charges, and the total amount financed. So what did his audit of these 38 federal disclosures reveal?
It revealed massive systemic compliance failures. Of those 38 disclosures, 53% mathematically overstated the amount financed. For example, he found a specific disclosure that legally locked him into a loan of $125.47. However, when you look at the back-end settlement data, the merchant only actually charged $119.
How does a financial institution miscalculate a loan amount on a federal document? I mean, walk us through the mechanics of that discrepancy.
It happens because of the friction between static disclosures and dynamic settlements. When you check out with a Buy Now, Pay Later app, the app generates a static TILA disclosure based on an estimated cart total. But sometimes things change after checkout. Maybe an item is out of stock, or shipping costs are adjusted so the final settlement amount drawn from the bank is lower. Sezzle generates the document at checkout, but they never programmatically update the federal disclosure after the final settlement occurs.
Oh, I see.
And under federal law, these documents must be accurate. By failing to update them, they are systemically issuing false regulatory documents.
Which seems like a massive oversight for a lending company.
Yeah.
But I want to explore the irony here, because Sezzle, like many BNPL platforms, publicly argues that they don't even really fall under the strict oversight of the Truth in Lending Act, right? How do they justify that?
This brings us to the core concept of fintech regulatory arbitrage. Many buy now, pay later platforms deliberately design their products to exploit a specific loophole in TILA. TILA typically applies to credit that is payable in more than 4 installments or credit that is subject to a finance charge like interest. So platforms like Sezzle design their standard product to require exactly 4 payments, and they charge 0 interest. By doing this, they argue they are exempt from the heavy regulatory burdens of credit cards.
So they engineer the product specifically to dodge the regulation.
Yeah.
But he catches them on the math again.
He does. He discovers that while Sezzle doesn't charge traditional interest, they do charge upfront service fees depending on the specific merchant order, sometimes up to $7.49. Legally, under Regulation Z, which implements TILA, those upfront service fees act mechanically as prepaid finance charges. And the absolute moment you introduce any kind of finance charge into the equation, the 4 installment loophole closes. You are pulled right back under TILA's jurisdiction, regardless of how many installments the loan has.
Wow. So they are operating under the assumption they are exempt, while mathematically charging fees that legally require compliance. It's a total regulatory mess. And while he is uncovering this, how are Sezzle's customer service agents treating him? Because from what I read in the transcripts, they were actively weaponizing the platform against him.
The transcripts reveal severe violations of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, or FDCPA. During an active billing dispute, he was on a chat with a Sezzle customer service agent named Lucian. Lucian sent him a premature collection demand that included what is known as a mini Miranda warning.
Right. Let's read the exact wording of a mini Miranda so people understand what we're talking about. It's that boilerplate text that says, this is an attempt to collect a debt, and any information obtained will be used for that purpose.
Yes, and the legal precedent here is crucial. By sending that specific language, Sezzle legally identified itself as a debt collector trying to collect debts owed to WebBank. But sending a mini Miranda during an active, unresolved fraud dispute before providing a written validation notice of the debt is a procedural violation of the FDCPA.
It's aggressive intimidation, masquerading as compliance. And the agent didn't stop there, did he?
No, he didn't. Lucian flat out lied to him about his legal rights. The agent claimed in the chat that Sezzle handles disputes electronically only and stated explicitly that they do not accept written billing disputes by mail.
Which is patently illegal. Under federal law, you always have the statutory right to file a formal billing dispute in writing to preserve your rights.
It is illegal, and it's also directly contradicted by Sezzle's own account statements, which literally list a physical mailing address specifically for disputes. Lucian then escalated the situation by threatening to shut down the account entirely if he proceeded with filing the dispute. And Sezzle actually followed through on that threat. They revoked his virtual card access while the billing dispute was actively pending.
Taking punitive action against a user for exercising their legal right to investigate fraud. Is there a specific regulation against that?
Absolutely. Under Regulation Z, taking an adverse action against a consumer's account, like revoking credit or closing the account specifically because they exercise their right to dispute a charge, is strictly prohibited. It is legally classified as retaliatory.
It is stunning to look at the hypocrisy here. Sezzle is a company built entirely on the marketing promise of frictionless payments. Smooth, easy, seamless. But the exact second a consumer has a legitimate problem, they weaponize friction. They use AI chatbots that run you in circles, they threaten to lock your account, they lie about your statutory rights, and they issue static, mathematically false regulatory documents. And if we look at the sources, this behavior isn't happening in a vacuum, is it? There are broader structural issues with the company at this exact time.
Right. The sources outline a very troubled corporate picture for Sezzle in early to mid-2026, which explains the aggressive tactics. If you look at the consumer side, they were holding a 1.1 star average rating on the Better Business Bureau database.
Yeah.
They had nearly 1,000 active complaints, and the vast majority centered on exactly what we're talking about: unannounced fees and a complete failure of dispute resolution.
A 1.1 star rating is almost mathematically difficult to achieve unless the failure is completely systemic across the board.
But the corporate side is even more revealing. In May 2026, right as this battle is happening, multiple national shareholder rights law firms launched securities fraud investigations into Sezzle's board of directors. This was triggered by a highly irregular event, the abrupt resignation of a key board member from the Audit and Risk Committee. The resignation was explicitly cited as being due to disagreements with executive management over corporate governance and key financial decisions.
When the person whose literal job is to monitor audit and risk decides to suddenly jump ship. That is a blinding red flag for institutional instability.
It validated concerns that had been raised earlier by aggressive short sellers, like Hindenburg Research. They had published reports alleging that Sezzle was using short-term accounting tricks to mask massive credit losses. The reports highlighted a severe systemic risk regarding the company's leadership. Sezzle's CEO, Charlie Youakim, had pledged roughly 70% of his personal shares, which represented about 30% of the entire company, as collateral for private margin loans.
Okay, so mechanically, if the stock price drops below a certain threshold, the bank issues a margin call. If the CEO can't pay, the bank liquidates 30% of the company's shares on the open market, and the stock completely crashes. So the executive team is under existential pressure to maintain cash flow.
Exactly. When corporate leadership is leveraged to that extreme degree, the operational pressure trickles down to every level of the company. You see it manifest in the aggressive collection tactics by chat agents like Lucian. You see it in the refusal to honor statutory dispute timelines. And you see it in the heavy reliance on cheap automated systems to automatically reject fraud claims and maintain the illusion of positive cash flow.
It perfectly frames why they fought so hard. But Dr. Royer has them dead to rights. He has the trilemma mathematically proving their data is corrupted. He has the 38 TILA violations documented. He has the FDCPA chat transcripts. He has formal regulatory complaints actively filed with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the FDIC, and the Wisconsin state authorities. This brings us to the climax of the paper trail. How does Sezzle finally react to this absolute avalanche of forensic proof?
On May 18th, 2026, Sezzle completely folds. They send him a formal written letter.
Read the room for us. What is the tone of the surrender?
Oh, it's beautifully bureaucratic. It's a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. They state that they respectfully disagree with his characterizations and maintain that they acted in accordance with all applicable laws at all times.
Sure they did.
However, as a quote-unquote business accommodation, they agree to waive his entire remaining balance of $2,183.68. They agree to submit trade line deletions to all major credit reporting bureaus to wipe his credit record completely clean, and they permanently close the account.
We did absolutely nothing wrong. Our systems are perfect. But here is literally everything you asked for. Please take the money and go away.
Exactly. They recognize the legal peril of the trilemma and the regulatory exposure, and they cut their losses. But this is where the story takes its final, almost unbelievable twist. So remember, Sezzle was only leg 2 of the three-legged transaction. Leg 3 is Capital One.
Right. Capital One is the institution that actually holds his money. They're the ones who originally denied his fraud claim by relying entirely on Sezzle's Apple Preview PDF. So Sezzle has officially backed down and admitted the debt is void. What does Capital One do?
This is where the automated factory line breaks down completely. Despite Sezzle officially withdrawing the claim and wiping the debt on May 18th, Capital One continues to aggressively escalate collection actions against him. On May 22nd, 2026, 4 days after Sezzle surrendered, he calls Capital One. We have the internal transcript of this call. He's desperately trying to notify them that the originating merchant has literally erased the debt.
And let me guess. The Tier 1 representative at Capital One has absolutely no mechanism to input that reality into their system.
None. The representative is completely locked into their automated script. He explicitly tells them on the recording, "I provided you with an additional new material change in the facts." They canceled the balance that they alleged I owed with them. And the rep just keeps asking for internal claim numbers, telling him they can't even see the documents he uploaded 2 days prior because they're still processing in the queue.
And mechanically, he has 5 separate Regulation E rebuttals actively pending at this exact moment.
Yes. And this is why Capital One's action on May 22nd is a catastrophic violation of federal law. Under Regulation E, there are strict rules about how a bank must handle a customer's money during a prolonged investigation. If an investigation is going to take longer than 10 business days, the bank is legally required to issue provisional credit to the consumer for the disputed amount so the consumer isn't starved of funds while the bank does its research. His checking account was severely overdrawn specifically because of these 105 fraudulent charges. Instead of issuing provisional credit, Capital One was actively escalating overdraft-driven collections and penalties against him while his rebuttals were actively pending.
So they are financially punishing him for the stolen money while they are statutorily required to be investigating the theft of that exact same money. It's a vicious cycle.
It gets worse when you look at the underlying logic. Because Sezzle wiped the debt on May 18th, Capital One is now actively trying to enforce a debt that the originating merchant officially acknowledges does not exist. The entire evidentiary foundation that Capital One relied on to justify their collections, Lauren Doolittle's 216-page PDF with the red squares, has been effectively retracted by the very company that created it.
Capital One is just a machine running without a pilot at this point, blindly pursuing a ghost deck because no human has the authority to press the stop button. What kind of regulatory nightmare is Capital One looking at by letting their systems run like this?
The exposure is immense. He didn't just win his money back. He weaponized this entire saga into a highly organized legal campaign. He has filed detailed, forensically backed complaints with the CFTB, the FDIC, the Federal Trade Commission, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and various state attorneys general. When you look at the institutional cost-benefit calculus for Capital One to continue fighting a customer over $2,800, it is entirely unfavorable.
It's terrible business. They're risking millions in regulatory fines to protect a deeply flawed, 2-minute automated process.
And there is recent heavy precedent for those fines. Just a year prior to this, the CFPB hit Capital One with massive penalties for deceptive practices. The CFPB has also actively pursued enforcement actions against modern fintech platforms like Chime and Zelle for exactly this kind of shoddy, automated dispute investigation practice. Capital One is exposing itself to massive, multi-million-dollar class action liabilities for systemic EFDA violations, all because their automated process failed to catch a state investigator's email address in a fraudster's profile. So bringing it all back to our primary mission today, we asked the core question at the top of the deep dive. Based on the mountain of documents, the statutes, and the timelines, does Dr. Royer have a substantive and valid claim against Sezzle, WebBank, and Capital One?
The verdict is definitively, unequivocally yes. His claims against all three entities are not just valid, they are forensically proven. He has meticulously documented massive systemic violations of the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, the Truth in Lending Act, and the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. He caught the institutions relying on mathematically corrupted data, he caught them violating strict federal timelines, and he proved that their legally mandated investigations are nothing more than automated rubber stamps of deeply flawed merchant data.
It is an incredible, exhausting victory for one guy who refused to let the machine run him over. But looking at all of this brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. Because while he won his specific battle, the broader war over consumer rights is taking a rapidly terrifying turn. If you read the recent corporate sources regarding Sezzle, their CEO has issued a strict internal mandate for the company to fully integrate artificial intelligence into every single workflow. Right now, as we speak, AI chatbots are handling up to 70% of their customer service inquiries. Over 80% of their new software code is being generated by AI. They recently partnered with a massive AI underwriting engine specifically to evaluate subprime borrowers.
It's everywhere.
Exactly. We are entering an era where alternative credit models and opaque AI algorithms are rapidly replacing human underwriters, human customer service reps, and human fraud investigators. This case might not just be a story about legacy banking failures, it might be a terrifying preview of the immediate future. Think about the sheer mechanics of what it took to win this. If a highly educated PhD, a guy with the absolute stamina to manually audit 38 separate truth in lending calculations, find an embedded .gov email address in a 216-page metadata strip PDF, and write a forensic white paper on the legal architecture of dispute suppression if he barely managed to fight his way out of this automated pipeline. What chance does the average consumer have when the AI decides they owe a debt?
It is a chilling operational question. When the accountability diffusion is no longer just between a legacy bank and a fintech app, but between a bank, a fintech app, and an autonomous machine learning algorithm, who do you even subpoena? How do you audit the math when the math is a black box?
Exactly. When the financial X-ray machine isn't just broken, but the AI reading the X-ray insists the broken bone is actually a perfectly healthy leg, how do you legally prove that it hurts? Keep a close eye on your accounts, understand the mechanisms of how your money moves, do not ignore the fine print, and never ever take an automated claim-denied email as the final word. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.